Many of these writers, disillusioned by the First World War, rejected the idea that they be complicit in furthering the accepted ideologies of their respective nations. They began to reject previously accepted ideologies, such as the notion of some glory inherent in war. They began to challenge these ideas through craft. Like Crane appropriating the medieval knight's tale, modernists began adopting and manipulating old craft techniques, such as the unreliable narrator used by Chaucer in the 14th century. They began experimenting with fragmented structure, dramatic interior monologue, such as in T.S. Eliot's poem, The Love Song of J. Alfred Prufrock, in which such elements are said to, quote, epitomize frustration and impotence of the modern individual, end quote. The modernists aim to make statements about their culture, not necessarily through direct speech, but through this manipulation of craft. As discussed with Crane's Red Badge of Courage, this idea of commentary through craft wasn't necessarily new, but it became the central focus of many modernist writers, and the main difference being that the primary objective of modernists was to challenge, not accept ideology as Crane does. Section 3, The Death of the Night. Quote, humanity. Can anyone really believe in the reasonableness of humanity after the last war with new inevitable wars in the offing, end quote, by Russian poet Alexander Blok. Out of this sentiment and view of the world, a new perspective on war begins to emerge. Chivalry starts to fade as dissent begins to stir, and we can see the early stages of this transformation in Erich Maria Remarque's 1929 novel, All Quiet on the Western Front. In this work, we see a perspective very different from Crane's, one that is overtly critical of war. All Quiet on the Western Front is narrated by Paul Baumer, a young soldier in the German army during World War I. Paul and several schoolmates volunteered for duty after listening to the patriotic musings of Kantorek, their school teacher. After 2 months of brutal training under the command of Corporal Himmeltoss, who treats the soldiers cruelly, the men are horrified by the brutality of life on the front, and Paul and his friends quickly realize that the ideals for which they've enlisted are nothing more than cliches. They find no glory or honor in war, and each day is spent hoping to survive to the next. Remarque was German, drafted in 1916 and severely wounded later, leaving him to spend the remainder of the war in a hospital. He seemed to challenge dogma early on, even refusing his parents' efforts to indoctrinate him in Catholicism. This was a trait he carried with him into war and into his writing. Remarque had heard the battlefield stories, making him conscious to some degree of the horrors he was to face once school ended and he was drafted. Many knew they were walking into a, quote, universal systematic slaughter, end quote. But Remarque, who doesn't deny feeling at least a small sense of patriotism, says that, quote, I had thought little once I was in the thick of it about the ideal I had to stand for. The idea of abandoning one's patriotism when faced with the reality of war is the core of All Quiet on the Western Front. Remarque is able to recreate this experience for the reader by withholding and slowly releasing information through the particular arrangement of events. Crane's novel starts with the first big battle, meant to be glorious, but the main character, Henry Fleming, flees once he sees the bloody fighting, and then feels he must restore himself to a place of valor. Remarque, on the other hand, begins after a fierce battle, where the narrator tells us nearly half the company has been wiped out. The choice Remarque makes here is, in my opinion, the structural backbone of the entire novel, intensifying the effectiveness of an otherwise ordinary war story. Arranging the events in this way allows the structure to lend meaning to the images. Because the initial battle scene is kept from sight of the reader, the images of the later battle become more meaningful, more intense. The story begins as the men are waiting in line for their daily rations. The soldiers make quips about how there will be double the food for them to eat because there are half the mouths to feed. The horrific event they've just experienced doesn't seem to affect the soldiers at all. This is best exemplified in the scene where the sergeant cook asks where the rest of the men are, and the soldiers tell him that nearly half the company has been lost. They're either in the dressing station or pushing up daisies. The cook was quite disconcerted as the facts dawned on him. He was staggered. And I have cooked for 150 men. Crop poked him in the ribs. Then for once we'll have enough. Come on, begin. The narrator goes on to say, We began to jostle the fellow, and they have fun making jokes at his expense. Juxtaposed throughout the scene are two conflicting moods. One, the mood surrounding the horror of the battle these men have luckily survived, the details of which we've only heard about. And two, the seemingly delightful mood of the soldiers, despite the number of casualties lost the previous day. Remarque chooses to begin here, after the battle, to create a sense of distance. He keeps us distance from seeing the war with our own eyes, which focuses our attention on how war affects the soldiers. We hear the battlefront stories, and the men react in a manner different than we might expect. They joke and jostle each other after the most bloody conflicts they've seen to date. About halfway through the book, we finally see the soldiers enter a horribly bloody conflict. By arranging the events this way, Remarque slowly builds up to the big battle. When at last we see war firsthand, the images are far worse than what until now we've only heard about. The conflict takes place in a graveyard as bombs drop and bodies are unearthed before the men. Quote, I open my eyes. My fingers grasp a sleeve, an arm. A wounded man? I yell to him. No answer. A dead man. My hand gropes farther, splinters of wood. Now I remember again that we are lying in a graveyard. The images are gory, almost over the top. Such was the case for Remarque and his fellow soldiers. The reader is met with unexpected brutality, horror that transcends the limits of the imagination. Through this, Remarque makes a clear distinction between the reality of war and any romantic notions one might expect from a war novel. Mirroring the gap between Remarque's generation and the previous generation, the narrative also makes clear a distinction between the then and now. Remarque begins by withholding the full reality of the first battle, slowly leading us towards the moment when we see the true horror of conflict, all while transitioning between now and then. Through flashback, Remarque gradually erodes the false sense of lightheartedness the soldiers appear to have in the beginning. The narrative shifts from the present to past moments before they were soldiers. The narrative shifts from the present, The narrator reflects on his past, allowing the readers to see the loss of innocence within the soldiers. In the following excerpt, the narrative reflects on how they were once embarrassed by having to use a common latrine. Quote, we move three together in a ring and sit down comfortably. And it will be 2 hours before we get up again. I well remember how embarrassed we were as recruits in barracks when we had to use the general latrine. In time, things far worse than that came easy to us. Here in the open air, though, the business is entirely a pleasure. I no longer understand why we should always have shied at these things before. Unquote. Here, the narrative moves from the present tense to the future tense to the past tense and back to the present. Remarque uses something simple, something trivial to show that the soldiers were once innocent, embarrassed even to go to the bathroom in front of each other. Paul, the narrator, tells us that in time, things far worse came easy to them. The fact that Remarque moves into the future tense before moving to the past shows that the effect achieved in this excerpt, a subtle communicating of a loss of innocence through the juxtaposition of past and present, is intentional, that Remarque holds tight control over the narrative. The shifting tenses fragments the narrative, slowly feeding us information seemingly out of order. In what Madison Smart Bell describes in his book, Narrative Design, in what Madison Smart Bell describes as linear design, the story would be told in chronological order, from the soldiers in school to them graduating, entering the army, and so on. The fragmented narrative that Remarque has created is referred to as a modular design, in which pieces are fit together like small tiles in a mosaic to form a larger, more coherent image. Information is given to the reader out of chronological order, but structurally arranged in such a way within the design that the information becomes more meaningful, more coherent. The following excerpt is preceded by the soldiers visiting their friend Keimrich, who is dying in the hospital. Mueller, a friend and fellow soldier, fixates on the dying man's boots. They're his size and he wants them. Less than 20 pages into the book, we don't know much about the soldiers yet, not even their age. Paul thinks about how Mueller is not wrong for wanting the boots, as good boots are rare. Quote, only the facts are real and important to us, and good boots are scarce. Once it was different. When we went to the district commandant to enlist, we were a class of 20 young men, many of whom proudly shaved for the first time before going to the barracks. We had no definite plans for our future. Our thoughts of a career and occupation were as yet of too unpractical a character to furnish any scheme of life. We were still crammed full of vague ideas which gave to life, and to the war also an ideal and almost romantic character. This information could have been provided in the first paragraph, but it wasn't. Remarque chooses to first put the soldiers in a situation where they seem callous and petty, worried more about what will become of the boots than what will become of their friend. After, the narrator tells us that once it was different, again creating a distinction between then and now. By placing this information in this specific place, just after they visit their dying friend, the information we're given about who they were before the war becomes more coherent. The information that follows once it was different lends meaning to the hospital visit, and the hospital visit lends meaning to that time before. At first, the soldiers seem cruel and petty, but become tragic when we learn they had, quote, no definite plans for their future, that now their future is the present, that back then they were still crammed full of vague ideas which gave to life and to the war also an almost ideal and almost romantic character. We learn what they'd been told about war, what they believed has failed them. And now here they were, their innocence so annihilated by the war that they become scavengers, picking at the bones of a friend. Remarque questioned ideals. He was disillusioned by the jingoism of his school teachers and the brutal reality he found out on the front. When writing a story that aims to comment on these things, you run the risk of talking at the audience, preaching, telling them how and what to feel. Through the structure or modular design, Remarque instead very carefully recreates what these young men have gone through, allowing the reader to emotionally experience these events on some level. By beginning the story after the first battle, the reader is left with whatever preconceived notions they have about war, the same as Remarque and many other soldiers were left as they entered the war, only to have those notions shattered just as the same as we too experience real battle for the first time as the scene in the graveyard unfolds. As the structure of the novel develops, the feigned lightheartedness of the soldier slowly decays, and the reality of their experience begins to emerge. Chivalry, the romanticizing of war, only exists in Remarque's novel as a cliche, as an example of the unreality, directly commented on near the end of the book in this excerpt. The poor brave wretches, who are so terrified that they dare not cry out loudly, but with battered chests, with torn bellies, arms, and legs, only whimper softly for their mothers, and cease as soon as one looks at them. Neither Paul nor his friends see bravery as a virtue. They are terrified much of the time and still fight, if only to stay alive. They find no glory in what they are doing, but simply are doing what they have to in order to reach the end, whether it's the end of the war or the end of their lives. When we finally reach the end, after the battle and all Paul's friends have died off, we are only told that he has died. We are only told that he has died some months later, and that, quote, his face had an expression of calm, as though almost glad the end had come. Crane's narrative asks the question, what's the point of fighting if there is no valor in it? Remarque's novel begins the arc of evolving sentiment towards war by shortening the question, asking simply, what's the point of fighting?
What Vietnam books did you use?
I used Larry Hyman's Apocalypse Story. That was my Vietnam book. So I tried to use one book from each war, and then I did do the civilian's perspective too, and I used Patrick Hamilton's Hangover Square, and so there were there were two World War I books, right, because of that? Yeah.
Yeah, because the interesting thing about this, as you progress through the wars, is the narrative, and the Bell's book captures this. The narratives are going to become even more deconstructed.
Yeah.
So you begin with something like Crane, which is like a journalistic approach,
Sure.
and you end with something like Papa's story and 7 voices in a narrator's head
Yeah.
who never says a word.
Yeah.
That's fast. That's a really rich topic. It's really a dissertation topic, and I don't think anybody's used that, because that's my area, and I don't think anybody's used the knight's tale or the lens of the knight. Use the hero to look at soldiers, but not the knight. That adds another layer.
Is Johnny got his gun World War II or World War I?
World War I.
You didn't use that?
No, I did use Johnny.
You did use
Johnny
that.
Guys.
Yeah, he has a long paper.
Yes.
It's very rich stuff.
Yeah.
So you talked a little bit about past tense, future tense, and the narrative shifts throughout, and I understand that's something that you'd like to try in your own writing. So how did working on this paper give you some thought about where to go with your own work?
Well, that's, like, shifting tenses is generally, like, writing essays, I shift tenses, but it's seeing it, because Remarque's such a good writer, and it's a beautiful book, and he does it, I think that, I mean, he does it specifically in this book to show that, like, he is in control. But it's something that I realize that, like, you have to be sort of on point with that, because if you don't do that correctly, it just comes off as silly, I guess, or amateurish. Yes.
I think it's just kind of obvious that, and I wonder what you think, but Crane did not fight in the Civil War.
Yes.
He based his book, I think, on stories he heard veterans tell, whereas Remarque went through it.
Yeah, he became a war correspondent like a year later after he wrote that book. But that was one of the reasons that when Taylor and I were talking about the book that we decided to use that, because he didn't experience war, and because of the romantic nature of the book, you know, it was that was sort of an interesting choice, because other than Patrick Hamilton, which I don't know if he experienced war, but he's from the sort of civilian's perspective, every book I used, they all had experienced war. And as you move through the wars, it becomes more and more, there's sort of more and more discontent within each narrative in regards to war.
Well, I think, you know, as part of it, I think the irony is, I mean, the Civil War, as massive as the war was, there's no, as far as I know, maybe you know of one, no great Civil War novel written by someone who experienced it.
Tell him that I don't.
Yeah, I can't think of.
It's all about post-Civil War.
There are a lot of accounts, so not fictionalized. There are a lot of memoirs, people recounting their experience of the war, generals, great men writing their memoirs. But I think that they all hew to this romantic ideal as well.
Yeah.
That's true.
Yes.
Even the soldiers' accounts, diaries, really value the written many years later, value the expression of the sense of purpose.
Interesting.
Do you think it's sort of praises a romantic notion because he was not involved in the war, or is it a time period and cultural thing?
Well, partly, as I read about him, he went to, it was sort of a military academy. So he had sort of done drills and gone through training. And I think it was a longing, like it was sort of this longing for war, and why he saw it as romantic. I mean, I guess it was probably at the time culturally, but what I read about my paper too is that the beginning of that, the book is very pastoral, and the paintings at that time, like Thomas Cole, I talk about Thomas Cole, and they're sort of these, they see man, even though he's sort of building buildings and all that, he sees him as part of the natural order. So that's part of what I talk about, is that I don't think, you know, they didn't really see it as an imposition. They saw it sort of as a part of humanity, as a part of it. Does that make sense?
Okay, good job, Casey.
Thank you.